He thought he was building a case that day, but in reality, he was building a sentence for himself. The morning air in downtown Chicago carried a sharp chill, the kind that slipped through tailored coats and settled quietly into your bones. And yet Danielle Brooks walked through it untouched, her posture straight, her steps measured, her presence calm in a city that rarely offered calm to anyone, let alone a black woman in a position of power, though no one passing her on that sidewalk could have guessed just how much authority she carried. Because she didn't wear it loudly, she carried it. The way truth is carried, steady, undeniable, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Her car parked just a few yards ahead, a black sedan polished enough to reflect the gray morning sky, her heels clicking softly against the pavement in a rhythm that matched her breathing, controlled, precise, until that rhythm was interrupted by something else, something sharper. The sudden flash of red and blue lights bouncing off glass windows and steel railings, painting the street in authority, in accusation, in assumption, and then the sound, a siren cut short, like a warning that didn't need to repeat itself, because it had already made its point. Danielle stopped, just for a fraction of a second, her eyes lifting slightly, not in fear, not in confusion, but in recognition, because moments like this were never random, not for her, not in a system she understood better than most. The patrol car rolled to a stop behind her vehicle, tires pressing firmly against the curb, and out stepped Officer Ryan Caldwell, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the light just enough to draw attention to itself, as if it needed to remind everyone who held power in that moment, his expression already set before he even spoke, already decided before any words were exchanged, and when he approached her, there was no hesitation in his stride, no uncertainty in his tone, only that quiet confidence that comes from believing you are always right, even when you are not. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," he said, his voice firm, practiced, the kind of voice that didn't ask for compliance. It expected it. Danielle turned to face him fully now, her gaze steady, her face unreadable, the kind of calm that unsettles people who are used to control. And for a brief moment, just a brief moment, something flickered in Ryan's eyes, not doubt, but irritation, because calm like that didn't fit the narrative he had already written in his head. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" she asked, her voice even, measured, not raised, not defensive, just precise, and that precision seemed to press against him in a way he didn't like, because it didn't give him anything to push back against, it didn't give him a reason to escalate. And yet he did anyway, because escalation wasn't always about logic. Sometimes it was about assumption. "We've had reports," he replied, his eyes scanning her, not for answers, but for confirmation of something he had already decided. "Step aside," he repeated, sharper now, and this time, Danielle complied, not because she was intimidated, but because she understood something he didn't. That power doesn't always need to resist. Sometimes it just needs to wait. She stepped back, the cold air brushing against her face as she watched him move, watched his hands, watched his confidence, because confidence can be a dangerous thing when it's built on the wrong foundation. Ryan circled the vehicle, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he knew there were eyes watching, because there always are, a passerby slowing down, a phone subtly raised, a moment being captured before anyone even knows what it will become, and then it happened. The shift, small but undeniable, his posture tightening, his hand reaching into the vehicle, his voice calling out just loud enough to be heard. Well, what do we have here?" And in that instant, the story he had already written began to take shape in his mind. But Danielle didn't react, not the way he expected, not the way most would. She didn't step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. Instead, she simply watched him, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something different now, not fear, not anger, but certainty, the kind that doesn't need volume to be heard. "Officer," she said quietly, "you're making a mistake, a very expensive one." And for a split second, the world seemed to pause, not for him, not yet, but for everything that was about to unfold, because the truth has a way of waiting until the exact moment it will be felt the most. And Ryan Caldwell, standing there with a badge on his chest and certainty in his mind, had no idea that this wasn't the beginning of a case. It was the beginning of his collapse. Ryan Caldwell held up a small clear bag between his fingers, his expression sharpening into something that looked like confirmation, like validation, as if the object in his hand had just proven every assumption he had walked into this moment with, the plastic catching the morning light in a way that made it impossible for anyone nearby to ignore. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted, subtle at first, then heavier, thicker, as a few pedestrians slowed their pace, their curiosity pulling them closer without them even realizing it, because scenes like this always carried a gravity of their own. And Ryan leaned slightly toward Danielle, his voice lowering just enough to feel personal. "You want to explain this?" he asked. But it was not a question, not really. It was a statement disguised as one, the kind that leaves no room for answers. Danielle's eyes moved briefly to the bag, then back to him, steady, unshaken, her breathing unchanged, her posture still composed. And for a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, not for her, but for him, because silence has a way of forcing people to hear themselves more clearly, and Ryan filled that silence the only way he knew how, by pushing forward. "Step around to the front of the vehicle," he instructed, his tone firmer now, louder, aware of the attention gathering around them, aware of the quiet lenses capturing every movement, every word. Danielle complied again, her steps measured, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, each sound deliberate, each movement controlled, as if she were not being directed but simply choosing to move. And that difference, though invisible to most, was beginning to press against Ryan in ways he did not fully understand. He placed the bag carefully on the hood of the car, almost ceremoniously, as though presenting evidence in a courtroom he believed he already owned. "You are in possession of a controlled substance," he stated, each word clear, rehearsed, practiced over years of repeating the same script, the same pattern, the same outcome, and somewhere behind them, a voice whispered. Another phone lifted slightly higher, the moment expanding beyond just the two of them. Danielle folded her hands calmly in front of her, her gaze never leaving his face, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same quiet certainty. But now there was something else beneath it, something colder, something that did not need to be named to be understood. "Officer Caldwell," she said, using his name with precision, not familiarity, "I suggest you reconsider what you think you have found." And that was when it happened, not a visible shift, not something anyone else would notice, but something internal, something subtle. Ryan's jaw tightening just slightly, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second, because there was something in the way she said his name, something in the way she did not raise her voice, did not argue, did not react the way people usually did in moments like this. And it unsettled him in a way he could not quite place, but instead of stepping back, he leaned further into it, because stepping back would mean questioning himself. And that was not something he was prepared to do, not here, not in front of witnesses, not in front of a narrative he had already begun to build. "Turn around," he said, sharper now, the words cutting through the air with finality. Danielle paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, as if marking the moment, as if recognizing that a line had just been crossed, and then she turned, slowly, deliberately, her movements controlled, her head held high. And as Ryan reached for his radio, calling in the situation with clipped, confident phrases, the city around them seemed to continue as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Cars passing, people walking, the ordinary world moving alongside a moment that was anything but ordinary. "Suspect detained," he said into the radio, the words echoing slightly against the buildings, solidifying the version of reality he had chosen to believe. And yet, standing just a few feet away from him, Danielle Brooks remained completely still, her eyes forward, her expression calm, as if she were not standing at the center of an accusation, but at the beginning of something else entirely, something far larger than this street, this moment, or the man who believed he was in control of it. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was almost quiet enough to miss, but it carried weight all the same. "You should stop while you still can," she said, not as a warning, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. And for a brief second, just a brief second, the air between them tightened, like the pause before a storm that no one sees coming. and Ryan Caldwell, with a badge on his chest and certainty in his voice, stepped forward anyway, unaware that every move he was making was no longer building a case against her, but a record against himself. The sound of the radio call faded into the background as another patrol unit acknowledged the report, the response crisp and routine, as if this moment were no different from any other, as if the outcome had already been decided. The second Ryan Caldwell spoke the words "suspect detained," and yet nothing about the woman standing in front of him fit the pattern he was used to. Nothing about her reaction aligned with the countless stops he had made before, because there was no panic, no raised voice, no desperate attempt to explain or convince, only stillness, only that quiet, unshakable composure that seemed to exist outside of the situation itself. And it was beginning to draw attention in a different way now, not just curiosity, but something closer to unease, because people could feel when something was not unfolding the way it should, even if they could not explain why. A man across the street lowered his coffee cup slowly, his eyes fixed on the scene. A woman standing near the corner tilted her phone slightly to capture a clearer angle, and the world, though still moving, seemed to orbit around this moment with a subtle tension building beneath the surface. Ryan stepped closer, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if he needed to assert control not just over the situation, but over the narrative forming around it. "Do you understand what is happening right now?" he asked, his voice louder, carrying just enough to reach the growing audience. And Danielle turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze once more, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if she were no longer observing the moment, but measuring it. "Yes," she said simply, her tone calm, almost detached. "I understand exactly what is happening." And something in that answer did not sit right with him, because it lacked the uncertainty he expected, it lacked the fear he relied on, it lacked the imbalance that usually gave him the upper hand. And for a brief second, that imbalance shifted, just slightly, just enough to be felt. But instead of acknowledging it, Ryan pressed forward again, his hand moving toward his belt as he continued speaking into the situation rather than to her. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, the words automatic, rehearsed. But even as he spoke them, there was a subtle tension in his delivery, as if part of him was trying to reassert a script that no longer fit as neatly as it should. Danielle listened without interruption, her posture straight, her breathing even, and when he finished, she nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as expected. "I will cooperate," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "But I will also advise you, again, that you are making a serious error." And there it was again, that phrase, that certainty, repeated without escalation, without emotion, and it lingered in the air longer this time, because repetition has a way of forcing attention, forcing thought, forcing doubt, even when doubt is unwelcome. Ryan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something he could define, something he could categorize, but all he found was composure. And composure in moments like this often feels like defiance, even when it is not, and that feeling pushed him further. "Save it for the station," he replied, dismissing her words with a wave of authority that felt more forced than before. And as the second patrol car pulled up behind his, its engine humming softly as another officer stepped out, the scene expanded again. More uniforms, more presence, more weight added to a situation that was already beginning to bend under its own assumptions. Danielle glanced briefly toward the arriving officer, then back to Ryan, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her gaze now, something quieter, deeper, like someone who had already seen the end of a story that everyone else was still trying to understand. And when she spoke again, her voice dropped slightly, softer, but no less certain. "Everything you are doing is being recorded," she said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. And for a moment, just a moment, Ryan's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with awareness, because he knew it was true. The body camera on his chest, the phones around them, the silent witnesses capturing every second, every word, every decision, and yet he straightened, adjusting his stance as if to reaffirm his position, because stepping back now would mean unraveling everything he had already set in motion. And that was not something he was willing to do, not in front of an audience, not in front of another officer, not in front of himself. So instead, he moved forward again, guiding the situation toward its next step, unaware that each step was not closing a case, but opening something far larger, something that would not stay contained within this street, this morning, or this moment. And Danielle Brooks, standing at the center of it all, remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and completely certain of one thing, that the truth did not need to rush, because it was already on its way. The second officer approached with a slower step, his eyes moving between Ryan and Danielle, as if trying to read a situation that no longer felt as straightforward as the radio call had made it sound. His name tag catching the light briefly as he came to a stop. Officer Martinez. Younger, quieter, his posture less rigid but his attention sharper. "What have we got?" he asked, his voice low enough to stay between them, but not low enough to escape the awareness of those still watching. And Ryan answered quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed alone could solidify certainty. "Controlled substance, found in the vehicle. She is being taken in." His words clipped, final, leaving no room for interpretation. But Martinez did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting to Danielle, taking in her composure, her stillness, the absence of everything he would normally expect in a situation like this. And that pause, though brief, was enough to register, enough to exist, enough to be felt. Danielle met his eyes for a moment, not pleading, not explaining, just acknowledging, and something in that silent exchange lingered, something that did not align with the version of events Ryan had already decided. "Ma'am," Martinez said carefully, choosing his tone with more intention. "Do you have identification on you?" And before Ryan could interrupt, Danielle responded, her voice steady, precise. "Yes, it is in my bag, on the passenger seat." And Ryan turned sharply at that, his expression tightening. "I already searched the vehicle," he said, his voice edged with impatience. But Martinez did not look away from Danielle. "I would still like to see it," he replied, calm but firm, and that was when the tension shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to change the direction of the moment. Ryan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then reached back into the car, his movements less fluid now, less certain, as if the act of repeating the search was forcing him to revisit something he had already decided did not need revisiting. The sound of fabric shifting, the faint rustle of a bag being moved, and then he pulled it out, placing it on the hood beside the small clear bag. The contrast between the two objects almost symbolic, one representing accusation, the other identity. Danielle stepped slightly closer, her hands still calm at her sides, her presence unchanged. "Inside the front pocket," she said, and Ryan opened it, his fingers moving through its contents with a controlled urgency that bordered on irritation, until he found it, a leather wallet, dark, simple, worn just enough to show use but not neglect. He opened it, flipping past a few cards before his eyes, landed on something that made him pause, not long, not enough for anyone else to notice immediately, but long enough for the rhythm of his movements to break. Martinez leaned slightly closer, his attention narrowing, and Ryan adjusted his grip, as if trying to regain control over something that had just slipped. "What is it?" Martinez asked, his voice quieter now, more focused, and Ryan did not answer right away, his eyes scanning the identification again, as if looking for a reason to dismiss it, a reason to invalidate it. But the words did not change, the title did not shift, the authority printed on that card remained exactly what it was, and for the first time since the lights had flashed behind that car, something real entered the space between them, not doubt, not yet, but something closer to awareness, something that could not be ignored forever. Danielle watched him, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had been expecting this exact moment from the very beginning. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Read it." And there was no challenge in her voice, no anger, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself, because it already exists. Ryan's jaw tightened again, his fingers pressing slightly harder against the edges of the card. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, not uncertain, but no longer as sharp as before. "Danielle Brooks," he read, his tone measured, controlled, and then he stopped, just for a second, just long enough for the silence to stretch, because what came next carried weight, and weight has a way of slowing everything down, even for those who are not ready to feel it. Martinez's eyes flicked from the card to Danielle, then back again, the air around them growing heavier, quieter, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting, and Ryan continued. His voice lower now, almost involuntary. United States federal judge, and the words settled into the moment with a stillness that no one could interrupt. Not the passing cars, not the distant footsteps, not even the quiet murmurs of those watching. Because in that instant, the story he had been telling himself began to fracture, not completely, not yet, but enough to reveal something underneath it, something he had not prepared for, something he had not even considered. And Danielle Brooks, standing just a few feet away, did not move, did not react, did not claim the power that had just been spoken out loud, because she did not need to. It was already there, already undeniable, already rewriting everything that had happened in the last few minutes. And for the first time, Ryan Caldwell was no longer standing in control of the situation. He was standing inside a mistake that was beginning to reveal itself piece by piece, and there was no longer any way to pretend it was anything else. The words did not echo, but they did not need to, because they landed exactly where they were meant to, heavy, precise, impossible to ignore. And for a moment, everything slowed, not in the world around them, but in the space between realization and reaction. Ryan Caldwell stood there holding the identification just a little tighter than necessary, his eyes fixed on it as if reading it again might somehow change what it said, as if the title printed in bold authority could shift into something more convenient, something that fit the version of events he had already committed himself to. But it did not. It remained exactly what it was, unshaken, undeniable, and beside him, Officer Martinez exhaled quietly, a sound so subtle it could have been missed. But in a moment like this, even the smallest shifts carried weight. Ryan, Martinez began, his voice careful now, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word before letting it leave his mouth. But Ryan cut him off without looking up. It does not change anything, he said, his tone returning to something firmer, something defensive, as if certainty could be rebuilt simply by stating it out loud. Evidence is evidence, he added, placing the identification back into the wallet with a controlled motion. Though the control did not feel as natural as it had before, it felt constructed, deliberate, like someone trying to maintain balance on ground that had already begun to shift. Danielle watched him the entire time, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, but there was something new in her eyes now. Not surprise, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if she had just seen a choice being made, not a mistake, but a decision to continue despite knowing better, and that distinction mattered. Because mistakes can be corrected, but decisions carry consequences. You still have time to correct this, she said, her voice even, not louder, not sharper, just clear, and the simplicity of her words seemed to press against him more than any accusation could have, because they offered him something he did not expect, a way out, and yet he did not take it. Instead, he straightened his shoulders slightly, adjusting his stance as if preparing himself for scrutiny, for resistance, for anything except retreat. You can explain everything at the station, he replied. The phrase automatic, but the confidence behind it thinner now, stretched, and Martinez shifted his weight subtly, his eyes moving between them, the tension in his posture no longer hidden, because he understood something Ryan was refusing to accept, that this was no longer a routine stop, no longer a simple report. This was something else entirely, something that would not stay contained within a single incident report, or a line in a system. This was the kind of moment that expanded, that reached beyond the people involved, beyond the street, beyond the morning. Danielle's gaze moved briefly toward Martinez, acknowledging his presence, his awareness, then returned to Ryan. Everything that happens next, she said quietly, will be reviewed in detail. And again, there was no threat in her voice, no raised tone, just fact. The kind that does not need emphasis because it carries its own weight. Ryan nodded. Once, almost reflexively, as if acknowledging the statement without fully processing it. And then he reached for his radio again, calling in the next step with a voice that was steady, but not as effortless as before. Transport requested, he said, the words moving forward even as the foundation beneath them weakened, and somewhere behind them, a car door opened, another officer preparing to assist. The scene continuing to build outward, layer by layer, while the core of it, the truth of it, stood unchanged at the center. Danielle Brooks did not resist, did not argue, did not interrupt. She simply stood there, composed, present, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. And as Ryan moved to guide the situation forward, there was a subtle shift in his movements now, not hesitation, but awareness. The kind that lingers just beneath the surface when certainty begins to crack, because deep down, whether he admitted it or not, something had changed, not in the evidence, not in the situation, but in him, in the quiet space where doubt had finally begun to take root. And doubt, once planted, does not disappear. It grows, slowly, steadily, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And as the siren of the approaching transport unit echoed faintly in the distance, blending into the rhythm of the city, the moment stretched forward, carrying with it the weight of every decision made so far, every word spoken, every assumption acted upon. And Danielle Brooks, standing at the center of it all, remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, calm, certain, and fully aware that the truth was no longer something waiting to be revealed. It was something already in motion, something that would unfold whether anyone was ready for it or not. The transport unit arrived without urgency, its presence marked more by routine than alarm, the engine humming low as it pulled into position behind the patrol cars. And yet the moment it stopped, the atmosphere shifted again, not louder, not more chaotic, but heavier, as if the weight of what had already happened was beginning to settle into something real, something that could no longer be dismissed as just another stop on a city street. Officer Martinez stepped slightly aside, giving space as the new officer approached, his expression neutral, unaware of the layers already unfolding beneath the surface. "What is the situation?" he asked, and Ryan answered with the same structure he had used from the beginning, the same clipped certainty, but now there was a subtle strain beneath it, something that did not quite align with the confidence he was trying to project. "Suspect in possession, ready for transport," he said, his voice steady, but not effortless. And Danielle stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence composed, as if she were not being moved forward by someone else's decision, but simply allowing the moment to continue its course, because she understood something none of them had fully grasped yet, that this was no longer about control, it was about record, every word, every action, every second becoming part of something that would be reviewed, examined, and ultimately judged, not in the heat of the moment, but in the clarity that follows it. And as the officer moved closer, preparing to proceed, Danielle spoke again, her voice calm, measured, cutting through the routine without raising itself. "Before anything continues, I would like to make one request," she said, and the simplicity of that sentence caused a brief pause, not because it was unusual, but because of how it was delivered, without urgency, without emotion, just clarity. Ryan looked at her, his expression tightening slightly, as if bracing for another statement he did not want to hear. "You can make your requests at the station," he replied quickly, attempting to maintain the forward momentum. But Danielle did not shift, did not raise her voice. She simply continued, "I am requesting that a supervisor be present before any further action is taken." And there it was again, not resistance, not defiance, but procedure, precise and deliberate. And for a moment, no one spoke, because procedure carries weight, especially when it is invoked correctly. Martinez glanced at Ryan, his expression no longer neutral, now edged with something closer to concern, because he understood what that request implied, not just in terms of protocol, but in terms of what this situation had become. Ryan exhaled slowly, his eyes moving briefly toward the gathered onlookers, the phones, the quiet attention that had not faded, and then back to Danielle. "That is not necessary," he said, his tone firm. But there was a fraction of hesitation behind it now, a slight delay that had not been there before, and Danielle held his gaze, unflinching. "It is," she replied, just one word, but it carried more weight than anything else said so far, because it was not opinion, it was fact, the kind of fact that does not depend on belief to exist. And for the first time, The structure of the moment began to shift in a way that could not be ignored. The second officer from the transport unit looked between them, sensing the tension, sensing that this was no longer a simple handoff. "Do you want me to call it in?" he asked, directing the question toward Ryan. And that question hung there, suspended, because it required a decision, not about the suspect, not about the evidence, but about the direction of the entire situation. Ryan's jaw tightened again, his mind moving quickly through options, through consequences, through the growing awareness that what he had initiated was no longer contained within his control. And yet, instead of stepping back, instead of allowing the moment to recalibrate, he chose to push forward once more. "No," he said, more firmly this time, as if volume could replace certainty. "Proceed." And with that single word, the line was drawn, not visibly, not dramatically, but definitively, because now this was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about continuation, and continuation, once chosen, carries its own weight. Danielle did not argue, did not repeat herself. She simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, as if acknowledging the choice that had just been made. And in that nod was something deeper, something final, because she understood what it meant when someone continues despite being given the opportunity to stop. It means the outcome is no longer a possibility, it is a certainty. And as the officer stepped closer to guide her toward the transport vehicle, the city continued around them, unaware that this moment, quiet and contained on the surface, was already expanding beyond itself, already becoming something that would not stay hidden, something that would not be dismissed, something that would eventually demand to be seen for exactly what it was. And Ryan Caldwell, standing there with a badge on his chest and a decision behind him, had just taken another step forward, not into authority, but into consequence, even if he had not realized it yet. The back door of the transport vehicle opened with a hollow metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been, not because of the noise itself, but because of what it represented, a transition point, a line between assumption and consequence. And as Danielle Brooks stepped forward without hesitation, without resistance, there was something almost disarming about the way she moved, not as someone being taken somewhere, but as someone who understood exactly where this was going, and more importantly, how it would end. Officer Martinez remained just a few steps behind, his gaze shifting between Ryan and the unfolding process, his earlier uncertainty now settling into something more defined, something closer to quiet concern, because what had once looked like a routine sequence was now revealing cracks, small but undeniable, and cracks, once visible, tend to grow. The transport officer gestured calmly, guiding Danielle toward the open door, and she paused for just a moment before stepping in, not to resist, not to question, but to look back, her eyes settling briefly on Ryan Caldwell, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, the kind of clarity that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable, the recognition that this moment was not what he thought it was, not anymore, not from the second he chose to continue. "Make sure everything is documented," Danielle said quietly as she stepped into the vehicle, her voice calm, almost reflective, and the transport officer nodded instinctively, because the request did not feel unusual, it felt appropriate, necessary even. The door remained open for a second longer as Ryan turned slightly away, his hand resting near his belt, his posture rigid, as if holding himself in place against something he could not fully define. The street around them had begun to shift back toward normal, the onlookers slowly dispersing, phones lowering, conversations resuming, but the residue of the moment lingered, invisible but present, like a pressure in the air that had not yet released. Martinez stepped closer to Ryan, his voice lower now, no longer public, no longer neutral. "We should slow this down," he said quietly, the words careful but direct. "This is not lining up." And for a brief second, Ryan did not respond, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if trying to align two versions of reality that no longer matched, the one he had acted on, and the one now standing in front of him, undeniable, documented. And yet instead of stepping back, instead of acknowledging the shift, he straightened again, pushing against the doubt that had begun to surface. "It is already in motion," he replied, his voice controlled, but thinner now, stretched across something unstable. "We follow procedure." And Martinez studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because sometimes people do not need to say they are making a mistake. Their actions say it for them. And the vehicle door finally closed with a firm, echoing thud, sealing the moment inside. Or at least that is what it seemed like, because in reality, nothing about this was contained, not anymore. Inside the vehicle, Danielle sat upright, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze forward, as if she were already beyond this ride, beyond the station, beyond the narrative still being constructed around her, because she understood something that the others did not, that this was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing it, and truth, once set in motion, does not stop. It moves, it builds, it surfaces, and as the vehicle began to pull away from the curb, merging into the steady flow of traffic, Ryan watched it go, his expression fixed, his posture unchanged. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, something small but persistent, like a voice he could not quite silence, reminding him of the identification, the title, the words he had read but not fully accepted, United States federal judge, and those words did not disappear just because he chose to move past them. They stayed, they lingered, they followed, and beside him, Martinez turned slightly, glancing once more down the street before speaking again, quieter this time, almost to himself. "This is going to come back," he said, and though the words were not directed at Ryan, they landed all the same, settling into the space between them, because deep down, whether acknowledged or not, the direction of this moment had already changed, the outcome no longer a question of if, but when. And as the siren of the transport vehicle faded into the distance, blending into the rhythm of the city, Ryan Caldwell stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by the illusion of normalcy, unaware that the moment he believed he had controlled was already slipping beyond his reach, already being recorded, reviewed, and prepared to return, not as a memory, but as a reckoning. The station door slid open with a low mechanical hum, revealing a space that felt colder than the morning air outside, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, a place where decisions were processed, recorded, and filed away with little regard for the weight they carried. And as the transport vehicle came to a stop just outside, Danielle Brooks remained seated for a brief moment, her gaze steady, her breathing unchanged, as if she were stepping not into uncertainty, but into something already familiar, something she had seen from the other side countless times. The door opened, and the officer gestured calmly, guiding her out, the fluorescent lights inside casting a stark, even glow across everything, flattening expressions, removing shadows, leaving only clarity, and clarity has a way of exposing what people would rather keep hidden. Inside, a desk officer looked up briefly, his attention shifting from routine paperwork to the figure entering the room, his expression neutral at first, then slowly narrowing as recognition struggled to surface, not fully formed, but present enough to create a pause. "Name?" he asked, his voice automatic, part of a system that moved forward regardless of context. Danielle stepped forward, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "Danielle Brooks," she replied, her tone calm, precise, and the name seemed to settle differently here, not as a label, but as something with weight behind it, something that carried recognition even when not immediately placed. The officer typed it into the system, his fingers moving quickly at first, then slowing slightly as the information populated, his eyes scanning the screen, blinking once, then again, as if verifying what he was seeing. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, the first ripple of something larger, and he cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his posture as he looked up again, this time with more attention, more focus. "Have a seat," he said, his voice no longer entirely neutral. Danielle complied without hesitation, taking the seat offered, her hands resting calmly, her gaze forward, as if she were not waiting, but observing, because she understood something the room had not yet caught up to, that the process unfolding around her was already misaligned with reality, and misalignment, when left unchecked, tends to correct itself in ways that are not gentle. Moments passed, small, routine actions filling the space, paperwork, quiet conversations, the distant sound of phones ringing, But beneath it all, something was building, something quiet but undeniable, the kind of tension that does not announce itself. It accumulates, and then, without warning, it shifts everything. The desk officer stood up abruptly, his chair sliding back just enough to draw attention. And he stepped away from the terminal, moving quickly toward the back office, his pace controlled, but urgent in a way that did not go unnoticed. Danielle's eyes followed him briefly, then returned forward, her expression unchanged, because she knew exactly what he had seen, exactly what he was verifying, exactly what was about to happen next. Across the room, another officer glanced over, sensing the change, sensing that something had disrupted the routine flow, and within minutes, the air began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Footsteps approached from the hallway, more than one set, measured, purposeful, and then the door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped into the room, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere, not because of volume or authority displayed, but because of the quiet control he carried with him, his eyes scanning the space once, quickly, efficiently, before settling on Danielle, and in that moment, recognition was no longer partial, it was complete. "Judge Brooks," he said, his voice calm, but firm, carrying just enough weight to silence the room without raising itself. And everything stopped, not physically, but internally. Conversations paused, movements slowed, attention shifted, because the title had been spoken out loud, not read quietly, not questioned, but confirmed, undeniable. And Danielle looked up at him, her expression steady, acknowledging without surprise, because this was not new information. To her, this was simply the moment where reality began to align with truth. "I see there has been a misunderstanding," the man continued, his gaze moving briefly toward the officers present, then back to her. And the word misunderstanding hung in the air, not as an excuse, but as a placeholder, something temporary, something that would soon be replaced by something far more precise. Because what had happened was no longer just a mistake, it was a chain of decisions, documented, recorded, and now, beginning to surface. The room remained still, waiting, because everyone understood, even if they did not say it out loud, that the situation had shifted, completely, irreversibly. And as the weight of that shift settled into the space, Danielle Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and fully aware that the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived, not with noise, not with force, but with truth. And truth, once spoken, does not need to be repeated to be felt. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt precise, like a room that had finally aligned with the truth it had been resisting. And as the man in the dark suit stepped further inside, his presence carried more than authority. It carried consequence, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles into every corner of a space and changes how people stand, how they speak, how they think. The desk officer straightened instinctively, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with a quiet awareness that something far beyond routine procedure was unfolding. And Danielle Brooks rose from her seat slowly, not rushed, not reactive, but composed, her posture as steady as it had been from the beginning, as if she had never been out of place, because she had not been. The system had been, and now it was correcting itself. "Judge Brooks, I apologize for the delay," the man said, his tone measured, respectful, the words chosen carefully, not as a formality, but as recognition. And Danielle gave a slight nod, acknowledging without needing to respond, because the moment was not about apologies, it was about clarity, and clarity was now unavoidable. Behind the man, two additional individuals entered, their presence quieter but no less significant, one carrying a folder, the other observing the room with a focus that suggested this was no longer a conversation, but an evaluation. The kind that records everything, not just what is said, but how it is said. And across the station, the subtle hum of routine had completely faded, replaced by something sharper, more attentive, because everyone understood, even if they did not fully grasp the scope of it yet, that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of accountability. "We are going to need all reports, body camera footage, and evidence logs related to this incident," the man continued, his voice calm, but leaving no room for delay. And the desk officer nodded quickly, moving toward the terminal, his fingers already beginning to work, because in moments like this, hesitation only makes things worse. And Danielle stood quietly, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, not seeking control, not demanding it, simply existing within it, because true authority does not need to assert itself. It is recognized, and across the city, just a few miles away, Ryan Caldwell stood inside the precinct hallway, his posture still rigid, his expression controlled, but the shift had already begun to reach him, first as a call, short, direct, requesting his immediate presence, then as a second call, this one less formal, more urgent, and by the time he stepped into the room, the atmosphere told him everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. The way people looked up, the way conversation stopped, the way silence settled just a little too quickly. And then he saw her, standing there, not as a suspect, not as a name on a report, but exactly as she had been all along, composed, unshaken, undeniable, and for a brief moment, the version of events he had been holding onto fractured completely, because there was no longer any space for interpretation, no room for assumption, only fact, clear and present. "Officer Caldwell," the man in the suit said, turning his attention toward him, his tone neutral, but precise. "We are going to walk through everything that occurred this morning." And the words did not carry anger, they did not need to, because the weight behind them was far more significant than any raised voice could ever be. Ryan nodded once, slowly, his mind moving through the sequence, the stop, the search, the decision, each step now replaying itself not as justification, but as evidence, and evidence, once seen clearly, does not bend, does not shift, it remains exactly what it is. Danielle watched him for a brief moment, her expression calm, not vindictive, not satisfied, simply aware, because this was never about revenge, it was about truth, and truth does not need emotion to stand, it stands on its own. "Every action taken today has been recorded," the man continued, his voice steady, "and it will be reviewed accordingly." And with that, the final layer settled into place, not as a threat, not as a possibility, but as a certainty, the kind that does not depend on what anyone wants to believe. And Ryan lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because somewhere beneath the certainty he had tried to maintain, he understood now, fully, completely, that the moment he chose to ignore the truth in front of him was the moment everything changed, not for her, but for him, and the room remained still as the process moved forward, each step deliberate, each detail accounted for, because that is how justice works when it is allowed to function as it was meant to, not loudly, not emotionally, but precisely. And as Danielle Brooks stood there, calm and composed, the weight of the morning finally settled into its true shape, not as an incident, not as a misunderstanding, but as a turning point, a moment where assumption met truth and lost. And in the quiet that followed, one thing became undeniable. He thought he was in control because he wore the badge, but in the end, it was the truth that carried the authority, and it did not ask for permission to be heard.